Blue Ridge Mountains, Virginia. Autumn, 1877. The leaves had already turned to fire across the hollows when Silas Hensley drove his shovel into the dirt floor of his half-finished cabin. His neighbors paused on the ridge trail to watch. What they saw made no sense. Instead of laying floorboards or packing the earth flat, Silas was digging trenches. Long, deliberate channels that crisscrossed beneath where his family would sleep, eat, and survive the coming winter. Word spread through the valley before sundown. Silas Hensley had lost his mind. He was a quiet man of Scots-Irish descent, 41 years old, with hands roughened by decades of mountain farming. He spoke little of his past, but those who knew his family remembered his grandfather, a stonemason who had worked in Pennsylvania and sometimes spoke of strange heating methods from the old countries. Floors that held warmth. Stones that breathed heat long after the fire died. Most dismissed it as old man talk. Silas, it seemed, had not. If you've ever wondered how frontier families survived brutal winters with a fraction of the resources we have today, and why some of their methods outperformed anything we build now, you're in the right place. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us. Have you ever heard of heating a home from beneath the floor? What Silas Hensley built that autumn would be mocked, dismissed, and nearly forgotten, until the coldest night in a decade proved every skeptic wrong. The system Silas envisioned had no name in the English-speaking hollows of Virginia, but variations of it had warmed homes across Korea, China, and the Roman Empire for centuries. The principle was deceptively simple. Instead of heating the air inside a room, where warmth rises uselessly to the ceiling and escapes, you heat the floor itself. The solid mass beneath your feet becomes a slow-release reservoir of thermal energy. Silas had no engineering manuals, no diagrams, only fragments of memory from his grandfather's stories, and an intuition sharpened by years of watching heat behave in forges, cook stoves, and open fires. He began by excavating a network of trenches beneath the cabin's single room, each approximately 14 inches deep and 10 inches wide. The design was deliberate. A main channel ran from the eastern wall to the western wall, with two smaller branches feeding toward the north and south corners. The trenches sloped gently upward from east to west, a detail that would prove critical. Over the following weeks, Silas collected stones from the creek bed a quarter-mile below his property. River stones, smoothed by centuries of water, ranging from the size of a man's fist to the size of a small melon. Oral account from the region suggest he hauled between 2,800 and 3,200 pounds of stone up the hillside, load by load, using a wooden sledge and his single mule. He lined the trenches with these stones, packing them tightly to form a continuous thermal mass. Above the stones, he laid flat slabs of local sandstone, each slab approximately 2 inches thick, fitted together with gaps no wider than a finger. The sandstone would serve as the radiant surface, the layer that absorbed heat from below and released it slowly into the cabin above. On the eastern exterior wall, Silas constructed a small firebox, essentially a stone-lined combustion chamber with a cast-iron door salvaged from a broken cook stove. This firebox connected directly to the underground channel. On the opposite wall, a vertical stone chimney rose 6 feet above the roofline, creating the exhaust point for smoke and gases. The physics, though Silas likely never used such language, were sound. Fire burns in the external firebox. Hot gases and smoke flow horizontally through the stone-lined channels beneath the floor, transferring heat to the surrounding thermal mass. Cooler gases, now depleted of much of their heat energy, rise through the chimney on the opposite side. The stones, possessing high thermal mass and low thermal conductivity, absorb this heat over 2 to 3 hours of active fire, then radiate it slowly for 8 to 12 hours after the fire dies. His neighbors saw none of this elegance. They saw a man digging holes beneath his home and filling them with creek rocks. Jacob Pruitt, who farmed the adjacent hollow, reportedly told his wife that Silas was building himself a grave. Others speculated he intended to store root vegetables beneath the floor and had simply gone about it strangely. A few wondered aloud if the isolation of mountain life had finally broken him. Silas offered no explanations. He simply continued to work, alone, as autumn deepened toward winter. By late October, the curiosity had grown strong enough to attract Jedediah Combs. Combs was the closest thing the valley had to a building authority. A third-generation carpenter and mason, he had constructed more than 30 cabins, 2 churches, and the county's only stone mill house. When men in the Blue Ridge needed advice on chimneys, foundations, or roof lines, they sought Jedediah Combs. His opinion carried the weight of experience and success. He arrived at Silas Hensley's property on a gray morning, breath fogging in the early chill, and spent the better part of an hour examining the strange construction. He walked the perimeter. He crouched beside the external firebox. He stood inside the cabin, studying the sandstone floor and the sealed channels beneath. When he finally spoke, his words were measured but unmistakable. "Heat rises, son. Every man who's ever stood beside a fire knows this. You're burying your heat source beneath the ground, under stone, under dirt. By the time any warmth reaches the air in this room, it'll be February and you'll be frozen solid." Silas listened without argument. Combs continued. "A proper fireplace, set against the north wall with a good stone chimney. That's what keeps a family alive through winter. Radiant heat from the fire, reflected off the back wall, circulating through the room. This," he gestured at the floor, "this is burying your fire in a tomb." The verdict spread quickly. Jedediah Combs had declared the underground fire bed a failure waiting to happen. For most families in the valley, that settled the matter. Reverend Thomas Aldridge visited the following Sunday, not to inspect the construction, but to express pastoral concern. He urged Silas to abandon what he called this distraction and focus on stockpiling firewood like every prudent man. Winter, he reminded Silas, showed no mercy to the unprepared. But preparation, Silas understood, could take many forms. While his neighbors spent October and November felling trees, splitting logs, and stacking cords of oak and hickory against their cabin walls, Silas completed his floor. He sealed the sandstone slabs with a layer of packed clay and earth, creating a smooth surface that concealed the channels beneath. He chinked the cabin walls with moss and clay. He hung a heavy deer hide over the single window, and he waited. The valley consensus held firm. Silas Hensley would regret his foolishness before Christmas. Some families, it was said, had already discussed taking him in when his experiment collapsed. Charity for a neighbor who had chosen poorly but didn't deserve to die for it. What none of them understood was that Silas had not ignored the laws of heat. He had simply applied different ones. The winter of 1877 to 78 arrived gently at first. December brought cold rains and a few light frosts. Nothing to test a well-built cabin with a good fireplace. Silas's neighbors burned their stockpiled wood at a moderate pace, confident in their preparations. Then came January. On the night of January 11th, 1878, a mass of Arctic air descended from Canada, sliding down the spine of the Appalachians with brutal speed. By dawn on the 12th, temperatures in the Blue Ridge hollows had plunged to 7 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, approximately 22 degrees below 0 Celsius. Old-timers would later call it the coldest night in 15 years. The valley awoke to a world of dangerous stillness. Smoke rose in thin, desperate columns from every chimney, torn sideways by gusts that cut through clothing and cabin walls alike. Livestock huddled in barns. Water buckets froze solid. The cold was not merely uncomfortable, it was the kind that killed. Inside the conventional cabins, families faced a grim arithmetic. A fireplace, even a well-designed one, sends roughly 70% of its heat directly up the chimney. The remaining 30% radiates into the room, warming the air nearest the fire while leaving corners, floors, and walls bitterly cold. To maintain survivable temperatures in such conditions, a family must feed the fire continuously, every hour through the night, burning through stockpiles that suddenly seemed inadequate. By mid-morning, several families had already begun rationing. They calculated how many days their wood piles might last if the cold persisted, and the numbers were not reassuring. At the Hensley cabin, the situation was different. Silas had lit his underground fire the previous evening, around 5 o'clock, as the temperature began its steep descent. He fed the external firebox steadily for approximately 3 hours, burning a mix of seasoned oak and hickory, dense hardwoods that produce sustained, high-temperature combustion. The hot gases flowed through the stone channels beneath his floor, transferring their thermal energy to the river rocks and sandstone slabs above. By 8 o'clock, he sealed the firebox damper, reducing airflow to a trickle. The fire died to embers, then ash. No flames, no smoke, no light. And yet, as the night deepened toward its coldest hours, something remarkable occurred. The floor of Silas Hensley's cabin remained warm. Not hot. The sandstone surface never exceeded approximately 85 degrees Fahrenheit, well below any risk of burns or fire. But warm enough that the soles of his boots felt it. Warm enough that the air above the floor, heated by slow radiation, rose gently and circulated through the small room. Warm enough that his wife and 2 children slept through the night without waking, buried under quilts but never shivering. The thermal mass, those 2,800 pounds of river stone and sandstone, had absorbed hours of heat energy and was now releasing it at a rate of perhaps 5 to 8 degrees per hour, a slow and steady warmth that required no additional fuel, no midnight labor, no desperate feeding of flames. By dawn, when the outside temperature reached its lowest point, the interior of Silas Hensley's cabin held at 62 degrees Fahrenheit. If this challenges everything you thought you knew about heating a home, you're not alone. Silas's neighbors were about to learn the same lesson, the hard way. Stay with us. The contrast became impossible to ignore. On the morning of January 12th, Jacob Pruitt's cabin, built the previous year with a conventional stone fireplace that Jedediah Combs himself had inspected and approved, registered an interior temperature of approximately 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Pruitt had kept his fire burning through the night, rising twice to add wood, and still his water bucket had developed a skim of ice near the far wall. The Aldrich family, 3 Hollows East, reported similar conditions. Constant fire, constant vigilance, and still the cabin's corners remained cold enough to see breath. Across the valley, the pattern repeated. Families with traditional fireplaces fought a losing battle against the laws of thermodynamics. Hot air rose, escaped through gaps in roof lines, leaked around window frames and door jambs. The fires consumed wood at alarming rates while delivering only a fraction of their energy to the living space. And then there was Silas. Word reached Jacob Pruitt by midday, carried by a traveler who had stopped at the Hensley cabin to warm himself. The man's report seemed impossible. No fire burning, no smoke from the chimney, yet the cabin warm enough to remove one's coat. Pruitt made the half-mile walk that afternoon, driven by equal parts curiosity and suspicion. What he found confounded him. The Hensley cabin was quiet. No crackle of flames, no glow from a hearth. The firebox on the eastern wall was cold to the touch, its iron door closed and lattited. And yet the interior air held a warmth that Pruitt had not felt in his own home for 2 days. He knelt and placed his palm against the floor. The sandstone radiated heat like a stone left in summer sun. Gentle, pervasive, unmistakable. "How?" he asked. Silas, never a man of many words, simply pointed to the floor, then to the cold firebox outside, then traced a line with his finger from east to west. "The stones hold it," he said. "Fire's been out since last night." Local accounts, preserved in oral histories collected decades later, suggest that Pruitt stood in silence for a long moment, processing what he was witnessing. The heat beneath his feet was not magic. It was not luck. It was physics applied in a way he had never considered. The measure difference that morning was approximately 27 degrees Fahrenheit, 62 degrees inside the Hensley cabin, 35 degrees inside the Pruitt cabin. Both structures of similar size, similar wall construction, similar exposure to wind. The sole variable, how each family had chosen to heat their home. But the temperature difference told only part of the story. Over the following week, as the cold snap resisted, Silas burned approximately 40% less wood than his nearest neighbors. His underground system, firing once each evening for 2 to 3 hours, maintained comfortable temperatures through the night and well into the following afternoon. His neighbors, relying on continuous fireplace operation, depleted their stockpiles at nearly double the rate. The arithmetic was devastating for those who had mocked him. Jedediah Combs, to his credit, visited the Hensley cabin in late January. He said little, but neighbors reported that he spent considerable time examining the external firebox, the chimney, and, with Silas's permission, a small section of the floor where the channel construction could be partially observed. He never publicly admitted error, but he never again dismissed underground heating as Highland ignorance. By spring thaw, the valley's opinion of Silas Hensley had transformed. The man they had pitted was now consulted. Families who had nearly exhausted their wood supplies asked careful questions about trench depths, stone selection, and chimney placement. By the autumn of 1878, at least 4 families within a day's ride of Hensley's property had begun constructing their own versions of the underground firebed. Local records suggest that by 1882, the number had grown to 11, each adapted to local materials and cabin layouts, but all based on the same fundamental principle that Silas had demonstrated. The knowledge spread the way most valuable knowledge spreads, not through books or lectures, but through survival. What Silas Hensley built in 1877 was not an invention. It was a rediscovery. Thousands of miles away, in Korea, families had heated their homes using an almost identical system, the ondol, for nearly 3,000 years. Archaeological evidence suggests ondol floors existed as early as 1000 BCE, evolving from simple heated stones to sophisticated networks of flues and thermal masses that remain in use today. In northern China, the Kong served a similar purpose. A raised platform of brick or stone, heated by channeled smoke from a cooking fire, where families slept, ate, and gathered during brutal Manchurian winters. The Romans, at the height of their empire, developed the hypocaust, an elaborate underfloor heating system that warmed bathhouses and villas across Europe, from Britain to North Africa. When Rome fell, the technology largely disappeared from Western knowledge, surviving only in fragments and folk memory. Silas Hensley had no access to these histories. He could not read Korean or Latin. He had never seen a diagram of a hypocaust or studied the thermal properties of stone. What he possessed was something arguably more valuable, a willingness to question assumptions that everyone around him accepted as truth. His neighbors believed that heat must come from above, from a fire visible in the room, radiating warmth you could see and feel directly. It was intuitive. It was familiar. It was also deeply inefficient. Silas understood, perhaps without fully articulating it, that human bodies do not need hot air. They need to avoid losing heat. A warm floor radiates infrared energy upward, warming objects and bodies directly rather than warming the air first. This radiant heat feels natural, even comfortable, at temperatures that would seem cold if delivered through forced air. And because the heat source is a solid mass rather than open flame, it releases energy slowly, steadily, without the constant attention that a fireplace demands. Modern engineers have a term for what Silas exploited: thermal mass. Materials like stone, brick, and packed earth absorb heat slowly and release it slowly. A pound of granite can store approximately 5 times more thermal energy than a pound of air at the same temperature. By heating stones rather than air, Silas converted a few hours of intense fire into 12 or more hours of gentle, radiant warmth. The men who mocked him saw only dirt and rocks. They saw a labor that seemed pointless, design that defied common sense. They could not imagine that the floor beneath their feet might be a more effective heating system than the fireplace they had built at great expense against their finest wall. They were not stupid. They were simply prisoners of assumptions so deep they had become invisible. Silas Hensley lived in that cabin until his death in 1903 at the age of 67. Oral accounts suggest he modified and improved his underground heating system several times over the years, experimenting with different stone types, channel configurations, and firing schedules. His children and grandchildren continued to use the system, and at least one variant reportedly survived into the 1940s before the cabin was finally abandoned. Today, radiant floor heating is recognized as one of the most efficient methods of warming interior spaces. Modern systems use hot water pipes or electric cables rather than smoke channels. But the principle remains identical to what Silas built with river stones and sandstone slabs in 1877. Sometimes the most advanced technology is not new at all. It is ancient, waiting beneath our feet, waiting to be remembered by anyone humble enough to question what everyone else believes. If this story changed how you think about heating, survival, or the wisdom of those who came before us, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And tell us in the comments, if you were building a cabin in the mountains today, would you trust the fireplace, or would you bury your heat in the floor? The frontier families who survived understood something we have largely forgotten. Comfort is not about fighting the cold. It is about storing warmth and letting the stones do the work.